Now, our next presentation is based around feedback from the workshops yesterday, and we have ALO reps getting up here to do this. So I see Siobhan and others. There might be
Sheila.
Are there others coming up as well?
No,
just yourself and Sheila.
Right, no, just myself and Sheila at the moment. But having said that, I mean, if the panel would like any questions are answered. I mean, the hosts from yesterday I think most of them are all here today, and they'll be able to help us out with anything, maybe, because myself and Noel didn't actually host the tables. We tried to collate the information as we were going along.
Okay,
so we weren't...
About 15 minutes. We tried
maybe even less, seniors. Okay, because what I need to say, what has become very evident this morning is really the feedback that we're going to give you now. An awful lot of this has already been said this morning by other speakers.
Okay.
You know, so the first thing, I mean, the aim of the workshops yesterday was to build on the document that we produced last year, and one of those priorities was assessment. So what we aimed to do this year was to take that a step further, develop it further, and maybe drill down a bit more as to what we would like across the board. We chose the cafe style. Now, this was new to me, I have to say, not familiar with it at all. There was one or two members of the executive that were, and I have to say that Alan was very appreciative yesterday before he left that we were willing to take on this type of facilitation, because we haven't done it before. It's new, but I gather from, say, what I heard last night and that, in the early part of the night, I'll say as well, rather than the singing session later on, but people seem to have enjoyed it. You know, so I think that it was a good exercise and that people really did enjoy the style and that it captured. Now, I need to thank the hosts at the table. They gave us a huge amount of feedback. What you're going to hear this morning, though, is really only based on the discussions, the verbal discussions at those tables. We haven't looked at any of your doodling, which we're really looking forward to, or anything that you wrote on the placemats or anything like that. That's for next week and the week after, as we start to collate all of this information, because this is not just about what you're going to see here today. This is a work in progress for us, as it was last year, and that we hope to produce a paper at the end of it that maybe perhaps could feed into what Mary was talking about a little bit earlier, about guidelines, because we do believe that, I mean, there is an awful lot of expertise and knowledge in this room. And, I mean, Alan explained that when he talked about the cafe style. It's based on the knowledge and expertise is actually here. It's at the table and it's capturing that. What you got yesterday were for those who weren't here really, were 4 questions, okay? And you were asked to discuss those. Now, there were sub-questions within that as well. But the 4 questions were based around the survey that you all would have completed for Liz a couple of months ago. And that was kind of brought together, and these 4 questions came out of that. Now, again, I want to say to the hosts, brilliant job. We got a huge amount of feedback. And what we tried to do was to pull the common themes from that. So what you're getting here is a snapshot of around each of the questions. I think that's all really the background that I need to give you on that. The questions, just to refresh your memory on them if you don't remember, then Sheila will actually give you the feedback on each of those questions, what we have put together for you, and then we're going to look at some of the recommendations that you actually suggested as well as part of your work yesterday. I have to thank Noel and Sheila and Liz for helping us to put this together and actually to draw the information from it, because there was so much on those sheets of paper when they actually got back up to the table here that we had to literally go through each and every one of them and try and pull the common themes from them. So these are, let's say, if you like, more the overarching themes of what you worked on yesterday, then with sub-questions within each. And the first one was the content and purpose. What should we assess and why? Then the methods and materials we use. How should we assess? What should we use? What should we do this? Capturing the results. How should we record initial assessment findings? And I think there's consensus, if the speakers this morning and in the room and from our work last year, that we all want some sort of common, I think Pat said it this morning when she talked about the Dublin model. When they're talking to their colleagues across Dublin, they each know what they're talking about when they're talking about assessment, and I think that's what we're trying to get to across the country. But we have to be mindful that there are differences in rural and urban areas, and there has to be flexibility at local level, but some commonality, if you like, across. And then what kind of structures do we need to get the best approach to initial assessment? So I'm going to hand you over to Sheila now just to take you through the feedback. And then I'll come back for the recommendations.
Thanks, Siobhan, and good afternoon. The presentation will be quite short. Rather than just reiterating what everybody has said this morning, the one thing we did find in the table is that the questions had a common theme, and I think by the time we got to the fourth question, people felt that they had already answered it in the first and second and third question. And that kind of became very evident as well when we were trying to put the chart together. I think the second part of the first question was what was initial assessment, and it was very hard to put that onto a chart, but we kind of just put it up like that. I'm not going to read it. I mean, I think this morning we've heard so much about initial assessment that there's really no need for me to be reading what's on the charts, because we've heard initial assessment and all sorts of aspects and everything on it this morning. The one word that we didn't use in our chart but was used quite a bit this morning was flexibility. But having said that, we used other words that capture the need for whatever assessment tool we use to have a certain element of flexibility, but we chose to use local professionalism and our own judgment in that area. So just carrying on from that then, we looked at the pros of assessment, why would we assess, and then the cons to assessing. And the question really was, what should we be assessing? Whether it's just literacy, whether it's literacy, numeracy or IT or whatever aspects, are a whole, the whole gambit of literacy. And we felt that there was a need to do that, because you need to have a baseline, you need to understand what the learners need in order to inform yourself, your practice, your tutors. So there was a lot of pros, and I think that goes without saying. I mean, there is a need for initial assessment in whatever walk of life you're in. And following on from all that it all leads into an in-depth profile of the learner, so that as a literacy organisers, as literacy schemes, as literacy centres, that we can provide the best possible service to our learners. On the flip side of that then, we are all very conscious that it is the needs of our learners that we're looking after, and that if we do have a system, whether it's nationalised or localised or whatever it aspires to be in all the changes that are ahead of us, we need hopefully not to lose focus of our learners' needs and the whole ethos of our learners, and that we move away from that approach, and that our learners become threatened, that we're not the welcoming centres that we used to be, and that our other probably big bone of contention is that funding, resources, staffing, they're all issues, and they will become more of an issue as we continue on, and that they don't limit our service to our learners. We looked at how can initial assessment be linked with ongoing review. Now, we got loads and loads of feedback, as Siobhan said, and it was very difficult to kind of just put a couple of snapshots onto the presentation. But bear in mind, as Siobhan said, all your thoughts, we have them. Be assured that we will be recording them when we do produce the paper, but these are just some of the three areas that kind of popped up on a lot of the feedback yesterday. In order to record it, people are using different methods: logbooks, learning journals and ongoing reviews. What methods and materials, how should we assess? I think, Liz, you probably just talked about that a few minutes ago. I think Janet talked about it a few minutes ago. So I don't think there's a real need to look at all the different methods. Kieran and Pat and Francis, they talked about their methods. So we're all doing something. We're all doing something. We all may or may not believe it's the right thing, but we're all doing the best we can. And the purpose of whatever method we're using is to gauge what our learner needs are, so that we can provide the best service for us, and that we're not putting learners into the wrong courses. And then, as a result, the learners, it's their last chance opportunity to come back into education, and we want to make sure that they get that last chance and they stay with us. And I think the other thing there is that we need to work very closely, which we are doing with the tutors, so that we can transfer the information onto our tutors, which Kieran and Alison highlighted this morning, what they were doing in the city of Galway, in order to progress our learners on to bigger and better things. How should we record initial assessment of findings? Now, this was probably the biggest area of feedback that we got back, and there are a lot of challenges. I don't have to say that. You're all very aware that there are a lot of challenges because we're all using very different systems. And I think the biggest area that came back, which has already been said this morning, is how do we record the soft skills. It came up with Janet. The questions came from the floor on the soft skills. So there are challenges, not only around the soft skills, but there are just challenges in how we record all the information in our systems. And then what do we do with that information? How do we best try and capture that information? And I think, again, as I said earlier in the presentation, there are common themes. I mentioned a little while ago that we have some funding issues. We need CPD. We need CPD maybe at a local area CPD. We probably need a national CPD. And times are changing as well, so we need to be able to keep ourselves informed of the changes so that we can best capture and meet the needs of our learner, depending on whatever tool we decide to use. And that there's consistency as well in what we use. That was just one thing for one person, another thing for another person, because a lot of our learners are now moving between centres. And it is so much better if a learner can move from around the country and they can bring their information with them, so they're not starting from scratch again. Because it is a big step for a learner. I don't have to tell you that to come into a centre for the first time, and you don't want that to be repeated if they do move around the country for whatever economic or personal reasons that may be. We also need to ensure that those performing the assessments have expertise in the area. And again, back to the learner-centred, learner-focused, that it all needs to be learner-centred and learner-focused, and that we're not just being pushed towards the accredited systems. National system. Well, there was a lot of talk about this yesterday. We talked about it again at depth this morning, whether we should have a national system. I think Mary said that it wasn't something they were recommending, but we'll see what comes out in the wash. There are pros, again, there are cons. If we had a national system, we might have consistency across the board. It might save time, and as I said just a few minutes ago, it would serve for those learners who wish to move around the country. But then again, there are cons with that. It could become very prescriptive, inflexible, and we might move away from reality. National versus local assessment, again, pros and cons. If we had a guideline, we'd all be doing the same things. We'd all be able to assess where learners are at, what levels they should be going into, get the soft skills in there. And then the local level, you go back to the flexibility, the more professional approach, the judgment. When you're actually working on the ground with it and you have a little bit of flexibility in it, you can capture the more qualitative and the soft skills that may not lend itself in a national assessment tool. Resources, again, at the risk of repeating what the previous panel speakers have already said, we're down to funding issues, national guidelines and standards and levels would be nice. A national approach to CPD would also be nice, and some supports around diagnosing special learning difficulties. And then on the other hand, of course, we have to be aware that we have to look after our own CPD locally, and we have to look at ways of, again, how do we capture things? And we're back to the funding again, and adequate and experienced staffing. I think that's the last of the charts. Just before we give you a sneak preview of that, thank you very much, and I'm going to hand over again now to Siobhan, and she's going to go through the recommendations.
Okay, these are some of the recommendations that you put forward for us yesterday. Again, no more than everything else, we couldn't possibly have put everything together or, given it back to you today in the format maybe that you would like. We've done the best we can in the time that we have and to try and pull that out, because we did spend a few hours yesterday evening, and Fergus was made very aware at the beginning when we were planning the forum that we were not sitting up to 2 a.m. putting presentations together as happened last year. So that was very much voiced to Fergus at the outset. So a recommendation, a range of good practice models, because we know those models, there are models out there. There is no doubt about that, whether they need to be adapted at local level or across, but there is a range of good practice models there, that these be made available to all VECs. Now, there was a suggestion of maybe 10, and that's why the 10 is in brackets. It was also suggested that these models should be peer reviewed by a working group who would base their recommendations on using the tools in real life settings. And that was felt to be very, very important if we were going to send these out to VECs with a recommendation or a suggestion that this would be used, that they were tried and tested and that they were fit for purpose. Discussing the results and consequences of initial assessment with learners, for example, the placement or not placing a learner on a particular programme. Now, as practitioners, we're all aware that sometimes we have learners coming in to the centre that maybe feel they should be placed at a particular level. But when the actual assessment is done, they're not ready for that level. They need something, whether it's a bridging programme or a lower level completion first, to actually go in at the level that they are asking to go in at that stage. It's very important that that is communicated back to the actual learner themselves. We also feel that there's a need for a common understanding of what we record. So again, this is going back to us all more or less doing the same thing. I mean, it makes it easier for the department, it makes it easier for the VCs, it makes it easier for all of us and all practitioners. If everybody is more or less doing the same thing, it's easier then to understand it, to interpret it. And also very strongly believe that the ALOA should contribute to the development of a national system, whether that's a set of guidelines that would be dispersed across VECs. But as I was saying earlier, Alan said yesterday, I mean, the expertise and the knowledge is in the room. And I think if we are going to set guidelines around initial assessment, we are the people here in the room that are actually carrying out these assessments, or the staff that we are managing are doing these assessments, and I think that it is important that the ALOA would be at the table to give an input to any guidelines that might be developed for distribution across the service. That's really all I have to say. There was one thing just that struck me, I think when Liz or somebody else was talking, and it was about Jay yesterday and about professional judgment. And I think if that's maybe something you will take away from this conference, is the trust in the professional judgment, because it was something actually that came back on quite a lot of the feedback sheets yesterday, was actually that terminology. Again, as Sheila said, we've heard an awful lot this morning and yesterday about initial assessment. It's not just about the work and our input into it, it's everybody's input. And I think we're going away from here today as the ALOA to take all of your contribution, but also the contribution of all of the speakers, of the those who shared their practice with us. This won't be the last that you'll hear from us. We will be bringing all of this together. It will be disseminated to you again for more feedback, further comment, whatever, through your regions. It's important too that if we misinterpreted any of the feedback that you give us, that we get that feedback. We interpret it as best we could and hope that we did capture the essence of what you were trying to say. If that's not the case, or if you think that we just didn't get it right, obviously we want to know about it. I'll leave it to the panel now for discussion.
Great, thanks,
thank you.
Siobhan.